we're live. Oh, we're live. Sorry. Hi, Reed. Every time I see the live is live, I just freak. But anyway, hi, Reed. Welcome to Venture with Grace.
Thanks for having me on, Grace.
Okay, so to start the show, I would love for the audience to get to know you a little bit more. So, you moved to SF. Well, you said this on a podcast, so it's not me stalking. But anyway, you moved to the Bay Area because of your wife is going to law school here. And why don't we talk about what were the early career journey like, and maybe we could talk about Plaid, and then before we jump into Stytch. So, what were the core lessons that you've learned early on in your career that kind of shaped you into who you are today?
Yeah, definitely. So I probably was in a similar spot to a lot of folks when I left college, not knowing really what I wanted to do, maybe knowing like directionally that something like business might be interesting, but not knowing exactly what I wanted to do. And so I did the very cliched thing when you don't know what you want to do, and I went into consulting. So I worked at Bain and Company, and then I was working in Atlanta at the time and was working on a number of these kind of like large scale consulting, like for Fortune 500 companies. And just realized like a lot of the stuff that you're dealing with there is more like cost optimization versus like growth stories, or at least a lot of the types of cases that I worked on. And so when my wife got into Stanford Law, then girlfriend, now wife, I had already been quite interested in like the other lens of business, which is, startups, high growth, like how do you like build something into a market, or how do you like grow a wedge into a market? And so that was kind of what spurred me to look at job opportunities in SF. Fortunately, it led me to Plaid, where I think I had a fantastic experience. I think it's a really well-run company in a lot of ways, and spent about 3 years there on the growth and product team, working on authentication in particular. And so that was where a lot of the kind of like origin story for Stytch came from. And I'm happy to go more into detail on that now, unless you want to pause for any more detail in the background prior to getting into the Stytch origin.
That's great. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, so Plaid, I feel like whenever people think about Plaid, people think about like the login to these like different banks and stuff like that, right? So why don't we start with like, what does like auth mean to the universe? And then like obviously people have login to Plaid or like other kind of like Venmo related things. And like also I'm sure like everybody log into using like Google or like some other logins to log into different platforms. And maybe we could talk about like, what does it mean to like have auth in your product, and then why do people build in-house versus not in-house?
Yeah, definitely. So maybe to give a little bit of background on how Plaid works, because that dives really neatly into authentication, what it looks like, what it means.
Mhm.
Plaid is an API for effectively integrating with like 10,000 plus banks in the US, Europe, and elsewhere. And the way that works, if you think about it, is that Plaid has to perform an authentication handshake whenever you are in the Venmo app or the Coinbase app or the Robinhood app, and you're trying to connect First Community Credit Union or Bank of America or Wells Fargo. And so from our perspective, we saw a very interesting landscape for authentication where even though auth is auth, like I log in with a password, I log in with Google, I log in with an SMS passcode, I maybe log in with my Face ID. You start to realize when you integrate with 10,000 banks, there's so many permutations to how everyone did it. Like some didn't even have 2FA. Some had much stronger 2FA like Google Authenticator or Authy. Some were starting to integrate biometrics. And so we had to find a way for both our system to work with all of those different authentication systems on the bank side. But then we had an interface within Venmo, within Robinhood, where an end user actually interacted with Plaid's UI. And that's where we were helping secure the actual end user authentication into those banks so that you could provision data. So for example, you may remember this pre-Plaid, before you could create this authentication that allowed you to share data from bank to like Venmo, you used to have to go look up your checkbook, get your account and routing number, give it to an app like PayPal or Venmo, wait 3 days for micro deposits like 6 cents and 9 cents to show up in your bank, come back to the application like 2 to 3 days later and enter those codes. And obviously, Plaid does a lot more than just authentication, but authentication was kind of a core competency of how do we actually allow you to, in real time, connect an account to another account. And so when you think about authentication, then generally outside of the Plaid scenario, you've probably seen many different, in your day-to-day life, you might log into Twitter with Google, and maybe you get an SMS 2FA code. You might log into a work, like a SaaS app, like you might log into the Stripe dashboard and use like Okta, because that is your like workforce identity, and you're logging in with single sign-on. And what you quickly realize if you're on the application side of trying to support, authentication, is that you can build it in-house. But if you're building in any type of complex space, the permutations of what you need to build and support and maintain become really large. So while you could build it in-house, and some folks certainly do, the reason companies like Stytch or Auth0, who's one of our big competitors, exist is to make it hours that you spend on this rather than months of engineering time, and give you kind of peace of mind that also will be up to date with the latest trends, whether that's fraud protection, new authentication methods like biometrics. Now, obviously, agent authentication is becoming big, which is now something that we enable for our customers if they want to allow agents to interact with their application. And so Auth is simple at the surface level, but it becomes quite difficult to untangle when you start trying to build in it.
For sure. I wonder from the product perspective, or I guess in the industry perspective, I guess how much are different companies that are spending on authorization? Because obviously you guys land some really big names like Cisco, Workday, all these kind of big companies. And I guess, why don't we start with as a normal company, what kind of product actually needs login, and what kind of product that you feel you work well with to help them with this authentication, and how much I guess are people spending in the entire industry? I guess how does the industry even look like? Because I feel this is such a thing that's everyone use, but nobody actually paying super amount of attention, right? So it's not a, I guess super consumer conscious product. It's a must. It's kind of a key, right? You can open a door with. I sound so stupid right now, but okay, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're right though. It's something that you take for granted because you probably go through 30 to 50 authentication flows in a given day for sign up or logging into something. And so virtually any application needs it. Obviously there's certain applications that don't require a user account, but those are pretty limited. I'm trying to think of, the applications I use that don't require a user account might be certain news sites, but even they're trying to push you to user accounts. Certain forums might allow you to read some information without having an account. But obviously, if you want to post something like in Reddit or Twitter, you need to have an account. And so really almost any application that is trying to get to production scale and production use case needs to have authentication. Now, the question is, do you need to go buy a vendor for that, or do you need to build that in-house? And I think that does differ, because if it's a really simple, small application use case where you're just going to do username and password, set a session for the user, or maybe it's sign in with Google, and you never need to touch it again, like some smaller consumer use cases, you might not worry about it too much. I would say where it becomes particularly complex is a couple areas. One, B2B authentication, and then two, consumer at scale authentication. So for B2B authentication, this is when I, as a Stytch employee, log into Stripe as our payments platform. And when I log in with our single sign-on. We use Google, not Okta, but Okta is another popular one for a single sign-on connection. And Stripe, if you think about their engineering team that thinks about authentication, they have a ton of different requests that they're fielding from different B2B companies on how people want to authenticate securely. Mm-hmm. So some will say we need to log in with Okta. Some will say we need to log in with Google or Microsoft. Others will say hey, this is a really sensitive B2B application. We need to be able to use YubiKeys as our 2FA, because we want to make sure there's a hardware token involved in the actual authentication so that people can't get phished, since this is such as financial data. And so on the B2B side, you can build it in-house, but I've found it's becoming increasingly less common, just because you could otherwise take so much of your time for supporting enterprise customers could go into just maintaining and building new enterprise auth requirements, which doesn't feel like a great use of time for someone if auth is not your core competency. On the consumer side, I mentioned that smaller consumer apps likely can get away with just offering sign in with Google and maybe a password, and they'll be fine, or maybe magic links. Where it becomes a little bit more complicated on the consumer side is, say that you're getting to the scale where it's worth fraudsters trying to attack your platform, whether that's bots trying to attack Twitter in order to post fake things, or Reddit, or if you're Cash App or someone like that, and they're trying to it's a fintech and they're trying to steal money by taking over users' accounts. That's when authentication starts to bleed into fraud prevention. And can you detect if somebody trying to enter a password or a 2FA code is a bot, a human, and on the human side, it can be a good human or a bad human. And now what's really interesting in 2025 is now you actually have to think about good bots and bad bots. because obviously the bad bots are the ones trying to like stuff credentials. Like maybe they're trying to submit a lot of passwords to see if they can take over, Grace's account at X fintech or banking app. But now also there are good bots where it's, if you're using an AI agent that you're trying to connect to something, like I connect my Supabase account to Lovable, which is a coding agent. I need to have a secure access flow so that Supabase can offer an OAuth token effectively, so that coding agent can do things on my behalf with certain permissions, but that I can always have consent management, revocation, things like that. So I'd say almost any app needs authentication. If you're very small in either the B2C or B2B side, you probably haven't run into too many complexities. As you hit scale in either consumer or B2B, on the B2B side, it's supporting enterprises. On the consumer side, it's usually has to do with like fraud prevention. That's where companies will think about, do I outsource this?
I think that's really interesting. So like, I guess like from your day-to-day work on the product level, so as you mentioned, there's like two parts. One part is like the consumer focus, which is like more of a fraud prevention. And then there's like the agent side. So right now, like since people are leveraging AI to code or like to create products, and then on the, I guess like the agents can on like trying to log in on your behalf. I guess like can you share a little bit more about like how does that work, and then how do you structure your day? Do you focus on, I guess I'm sure on your team there's like, I guess, the fraud prevention team, and then there's like the agent team or some other team. So like I guess like from running the company and then creating product perspective, how do you think about leveraging the team to like build these like different subsectors, and then what kind of challenges do you guys encounter on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, definitely. So first on the agents piece, and if people are interested in this, we actually just posted today another blog post on it that
Mhm.
kind of explains how this works in detail
Mhm.
for agent authentication. But we have a lot of good content on the blog, stitch.com/blog, if people are interested. But generally, if you think about it, it's not too different when you want to authenticate or authorize an agent to act on your behalf than when, say, you're using an application like Calendly that wants access to your Google account, where you might connect to your Google account. And what you do is you'll say, connect my Google account. And then you'll get that like consent pane, which
Mhm.
is that UI that says, hey, Calendly is asking, can they get access to your calendar information? Maybe if you're like connecting to Superhuman, which is an email client, can they get access to your emails and actually like write emails, send emails, read them, et cetera? And so that is called OAuth, that authorization flow, because authenticating is just like knowing who you are, right? Like that sign in with Google, this is Reed. Authorization is a little bit different than authentication, where it's, I'm actually authorizing this app Calendly to use my Google account. Or with agents, it's quite similar. I'm authorizing the Lovable coding agent to connect to my Supabase account, make changes like, row level security policy changes, make database schema changes, things like that. And so that's really where the agent side comes in, is it's quite similar to OAuth. It just has some other things you need to think about, like human in the loop confirmation for certain sensitive tasks, consent management so that you can revoke access if you want to. And so but it is similar to kind of like the Calendly, Google, like old school flavor of how you'd authorize different apps to connect on your behalf. In terms of like how we segment the company, on the product and engineering side, we have a few different teams. We have some of your like core teams that you'd expect, like infrastructure, security, things like that. And then really on the product side, we have what is an Auth products team, which is like the core authentication protocols, technologies that we're building. We have an SDKs team, which then builds like UIs and SDKs on top of our APIs to make it really simple for somebody to embed into their application. And then we have a fraud products team, which is like anti-bot products and features, agent detection, like, if you want to detect potential malicious agents on your website. And so that's generally how we format it. Is we have a couple of like core teams, which are kind of, you could expect at any developer infrastructure company, like, the infrastructure engineering team, the SDK team. But then we also have things like an Auth products team that just builds authentication products and features, and then a fraud products team that just builds fraud features. And on top of that, of course, we also have a web team that deals with like marketing site, things like that in our docs. But overall, that's the general setup of the company on the product and eng side. In terms of like challenges we run into, I would say it's an interesting space in that it's maybe not moving at lightning speed, but every year there's some pretty material change in how authentication works. So I'll give you two examples. We like the one for 2025 that we're talking about is agents, right? Agents have changed how you think about authenticating, because it's not just Reed that's accessing his account at Calendly. I might be delegating access to an agent as well. And so now I have to think about effectively like multiple roles and permissions for different types of actors on my behalf. That's the 2025 kind of like flavor of authentication that started to evolve with technology. 2024, one of the big narratives was passkeys, which passkeys are, if you've had a chance to enroll in this, a number of apps have started to adopt them. It's effectively cross-device biometrics, so that I can like sign up for an app with Face ID on my mobile phone, and then go to my laptop. And if I'm logged in the same iCloud, I can log in with Touch ID to that website 10 minutes later. And that's the kind of concept of like making biometrics supported at scale in web applications. We've obviously had biometrics on the OS level for a very long time. That's how you log into your phone with Face ID or your laptop. But that was something that was like a big change in 2024, where a lot of companies wanted to adopt the ability to have this within their app, not just at the OS level. And so that's probably one of the interesting challenges, but also opportunities, is that something big changes usually every like 12 to 18 months. Even if it doesn't change everything about authentication, it adds additional complexity or new optionality for end users and customers.
I have a question on like, I think you guys started with like I guess like keyless, or like I guess like passwordless authentication. Does that mean it's just primarily biometrics, or is there like any other ways to authenticate? Nowadays, I mean, I like as a consumer, I've seen obviously like if you touch a button on your MacBook or iPhone, like, and then they just like log you in with a certain app. I guess how does Stitch come in? So like, do you have to work with Apple's biometrics team to like actually link a specific lines of code to process that, or like what does that mean? And then also I think you mentioned something really interesting is like different apps, or let's call it like a Calendly, or like, you know, you guys have a lot of like really great logos on the website, like obviously we don't have to go into specifics, but I guess like for like a Calendly or a Zapier or like or a Cisco or a Grok, like they probably need different levels of authentication. How much of it do you have to personally tailor to a specific company versus like I guess like as a tech company, like I guess like do you guys have to white glove on everything? Like do you reuse any code base, or do you have to like literally manually recreating these things to act as like a service company?
Great question. So on the initial part of that question of like passwordless, we consider an umbrella of different authentication features. So biometrics is one of them, but the other ones that we support are things like email magic links, email one-time passcode, sign in with Google, sign in with Microsoft. Those are technically passwordless in the like that you might have a password with Microsoft or Google, but it's typically passwordless when you actually connect it to another
Oh,
account.
I have a question. So like
Yes.
because since you mentioned about like the Google Microsoft thing, what happens on the back end? Does it just like copy paste my entire Google password into this company and then as I created a new account, or like does it just primarily just like, oh, you can log in one time, whenever you log in you have to use Google, but you actually don't recreate an account on the back end?
Good question. So fortunately, it does not copy paste your password. We actually like what's really nice about like the Google and Microsoft and all of these OAuth, we call them OAuth connections. They're like social logins. Is that there's no passwords, no like private like sensitive credentials like that get shared with the other application that you're connecting, you're logging in with Google. Instead, what happens is there's an authorization and authentication that takes place with Google to verify this is Reed at Stytch.com. And then an access token is given to that application so that we can effectively enable like the ongoing access. And yes, you might have to log in again every couple months, depending on the session length, or maybe more frequently, less frequently, depending on the application. But to your point, then that kind of gets into the piece of different, because different customers have very different needs, like a Calendly versus a Grok versus a Replit versus Cisco, et cetera. Typically, what you'll find is that if you go to our actual like docs in our product page, you'll see we have a ton of different authentication products. Like if I had to estimate off the top of my head, we probably have something like 20 authentication products, which is
Mhm.
more than any individual application needs, but typically you need more than one. So often like these customers are integrating like 3 to 4 different options. Like take Grok as an example. I think they use us with Google, GitHub, email magic link, maybe email password, and then I also like enterprise single sign-on. And
Mhm.
so if you think about that, they're using a menu of like 4 options out of the 20.
Mhm.
And we don't have to fortunately do anything custom when they come inbound because we have different configurations in our SDKs and our APIs to make that so that that can all be self-serve. And so obviously we had to build the platform to be both expansive and then configurable in order to enable that. But it gives you the nice benefit that even though you have to build a lot, you don't have to build things white glove for folks.
Mm. How, I guess, like, what type of like tailored thing that do you have to change for each organization? I mean, we definitely don't have to go into the specifics, but more towards like, let's say like a Replit or like some AI organization that they probably need like a very different setup than, Calendly, which is like a more consumer facing product versus Cisco, which is like a traditional tech company. How do you think about the different kind of Auth product that they need and why?
Yeah. So often, like the big ways that you can slice it are first by is it a consumer use case or is it a business to business use case, like a SaaS use case?
Mhm.
Because if it's the SaaS use case, you might be logging in with an enterprise single sign-on, like Azure or Okta or something like that. On the consumer use case, they're probably going to want to have high converting, low friction ways for the end user to log in, like Google, Apple, maybe Microsoft, um, email magic link, et cetera. And then where I'd say you get differences as well is on the vertical. So for example, our fintech customers in consumer or our AI customers in B2B typically have a lot more fraudulent attacks against them. So they'll implement things like our device fingerprinting and anti-bot tools, which is just a couple lines of code, but maybe not every application needs that. I would say most applications are starting to need that now because of the level of fraud and bots online. But for the most part, you might have a much bigger use case for that if you're a Replit or if you're Grok, because you actually have AI compute that users can access. So what you don't want users to do is create thousands or tens of thousands of fake accounts in order to get free $100 of AI credits, right? That's like one of the things they're trying to stop. And so they'll use things like device fingerprinting on top of that to make sure that they're preventing, we call it multi-account abuse, where somebody is creating many accounts in order to access a free trial or a free resource. And
Mm.
so typically it ends up coming down to, are you consumer or B2B and what vertical you in? Because that will tell us who are the customers you're serving. So like what type of experience do you want to give to them? And also what types of threats are you trying to mitigate on your application?
Mm. For like let's talk about fraud. So like how are the hackers actually hacking these things typically? And obviously I think I can think of is just like um they just whenever they find your password somewhere and then they just reuse that password for five different things. But what are the ways that to prevent that from happening? And I guess like how does it work from the back end?
Yeah, so there's two types of fraud, first party fraud and third party fraud. I'll start with third party fraud because I think that's what people's mind like leaps to when they first think about it, especially in authentication realm, where that is the case where somebody else is trying to abuse your account or another individual's account. So it's a third party trying to take advantage of them. This is where account takeover comes into play. So say I have an account with Bank of America. If somebody wanted to steal my account or gain access to try to move money, what they would probably do, unfortunately, I have protections against this, but what they would probably do is, every week or 2 weeks, there's some major database breach with passwords in it. And so typically you can find those on the dark web. And so what bad actors will do is they'll go download that list of credentials, and then they'll take those credentials that were breached at like 23andMe or Best Buy or Target, and then they'll try to run a credential stuffing script. So they're like automating bots to send those credentials. So like james@gmail.com and my password 12345, they'll
Mhm.
send those to as many sensitive applications as they can. So they'll write a script that runs it at PayPal, Venmo, Cash App, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, et cetera. And they're just waiting to see a hit. Like they know their success rate might be like 5%. But for them, 5% on a list of 10 million breach credentials that can then get into a financial account allows them access so that they can start to move money. Obviously, there are protections that you should have in place. Like you should have anti-bot controls that stop the credential stuffing in the first place. If somebody does steal a password, you should have some type of 2FA that's unphishable, like a pass key or a biometric that, but not everyone does, but those are the ways that you can protect against it. And that's third-party fraud. First-party fraud is where the end user that owns the account is actually the fraudulent actor. And this is a case where like somebody is signing up for your product or service, literally just with the purpose to abuse your platform. So if you think about this, this would be, if you're on Twitter, you might get all of these DMs and tweets where it's like people that are doing airdrops for like crypto tokens. I would call that first party fraud effectively, where usually, sometimes they're stealing other people's accounts. So sometimes third party fraud comes into it, but a lot of the times somebody is creating lots of accounts in order to abuse a resource or a community. And the AI apps, lots of folks will do this to create, thousands of accounts so that they can get the free $100 of like OpenAI credits or Grok credits or whatever they're trying to abuse. And that is where what you need to make sure you're still doing is preventing automation. So you don't want people doing like headless browser automation or just truly running a script on your website in order to do that. But then also there's sometimes manual abuse. Like there are things called like click farms where it's, in certain parts of the world, there will just be, a factory of people that are just manually creating all of these accounts in order to abuse a resource. There's a large e-commerce company we're working with where this is the problem they had, where they were running a promotion where like you could get $3 in your account if you signed up for an account. Obviously, all of these people started creating, like the first party fraud, or they started creating all of these accounts to get the $3, move it off platform. And there, yes, you need to make sure that you have anti-bot controls to stop the automation of it. But sometimes it's a click farm where it's really just like 100 people doing this like 18 hours a day. And there, what you need is really specific like fingerprinting on and forensic fingerprinting on like the device level, so that you can say this device can only ever create one account. Like if they try to create a second account, we'd recognize from the forensic like hardware fingerprint, browser fingerprint, network fingerprint, this is actually the same person. They're probably at a click farm or they're just in their home manually trying to abuse it. Sometimes we find there's clusters on universities where people are trying to like crypto mine on other platforms. Like, you might try to sign up for an analytics platform or a cloud platform in order to crypto mine and use some of the free credits there. And so that's really where first party fraud comes in.
Wow. Oh, that's so interesting to think about. So I guess like when you're facing these problems, like do you guys have, since you mentioned you guys have like over 20 type of different products, why don't we start with like when you were building your company, who was like the first customer that you had in mind, and then how did you kind of like build the first version of the product?
Great question. So the first customer we had in mind was actually ourselves, which is probably a pretty common thing that you hear, where I was working on authentication at Plaid at the time, and I'd worked with my co-founder Julianna on authentication at Plaid as well. She had then left to go to Very Good Security, and we at the same time we were going through different authentication headaches that were leading us to kind of like the origin idea for Stytch. On my side, we had an in-house team that was working on authentication fraud prevention, and we were trying to outsource it. Like we didn't want to be in-house anymore because we were spending a lot of cycles on it. We wanted to add new authentication methods like passwordless. We wanted new anti-bot controls, so we didn't want to have to build it all in-house. So we tried to actually do a POC with companies like Auth0 and other kind of like, incumbents like AWS Cognito, et cetera, and found generally that they're quite inflexible. Like it felt like we were working with like a PayPal for authentication rather than a Stripe for authentication. And so we've always thought you should be able to outsource your auth, but not your UX if you want to. And so we have a much more like white labelable experience than a lot of providers. And that was kind of the use case at Plaid, where we wanted to move to a vendor. We just couldn't find a vendor that was flexible enough, had all of the kind of like bells and whistles that we needed and that we were excited about in terms of modernizing our stack. At Very Good Security, Julianna was actually at the same time ripping out Auth0 and moving to in-house for the same reason. Like, it's kind of different, where they had started with Auth0, then become frustrated with it and decided to move to in-house because they couldn't get the level of customization they needed. We on the other side at Plaid were evaluating them, but then decided not to go with them because it was not customizable enough, as well as didn't have things like the fraud features built in that we needed. And so really we had ourselves in mind. And then it was interesting when we built the product, we knew that since any app can use authentication, one of the first things that we built was a self-serve flow, because our view was, and this is not a crazy insight, but most developers don't want to talk to salespeople, right? They want to actually see your product, get to use it, get up and running quickly. And so if you open up your application, and if it's a broad-based application that's not just trying to sell to like Fortune 500, then having that self-serve flow is really important, because then you open up the aperture to like the long tail of the internet for anyone creating an app to test out your product and use it. So while we had ourselves in mind, we did understand that this was a generalizable enough use case that immediately we went self-serve. And then pretty early on, after we raised our seed, we started getting inbound from enterprises where we didn't have every feature that enterprises wanted, but some were willing to take the leap. Like I remember one of our first big like 6-figure deals was a crypto company, and they really wanted to go passwordless. They were going from an in-house system to passwordless. They didn't want to build all of this out like manually, and they also didn't want to maintain it afterwards. And so they were a great example where even though they weren't who we had exactly in mind when we started the company, it was a very similar use case to what we had experienced at Plaid and very good security.
I wonder, so like since you mentioned about, I mean, I also saw your website, there's like the comparison between Stytch and Auth0. Why do you feel like they're not building these things? Like for example, the customizable things, and like, yeah, like I'm just out of curiosity, like since sounds like this is like something very like a lot of like customer would need.
It's a good question. And I think it ultimately comes down to probably a different architectural philosophy or market philosophy where, and also I think when they were built, like, being built in the late 2000s versus 2020 is a very different like architectural, like, decision, like framework that you might apply. And the reason I liken it to like the PayPal versus Stripe approach is that like the PayPal approach and the Auth0 approach are not wrong inherently. Like it is helpful that they have like what they call as universal login. It's just like a hosted page you redirect a user to. You don't have that much control over it, but it gets the job done. And that does give you some benefits of simplicity, right? Where like you just send the user to another place. Obviously, as companies want to make sure that they're owning UX, UI, conversion, design, they do start to care more about can I actually, and also developers want control typically because it makes their job easier long term. But like I would say they chose, I think it was partially when they were built that they're like, just build the simplest thing. Office as a service is kind of new. Let's do it the PayPal model just to handle it all for you. Yes, we're more opinionated. Yes, you have less flexibility, but you get what you want at the end of the day, or at least you get an authentication flow at the end of the day. I think as people become more like a bit like more artisanal with their taste over the 2010s, where like you don't want your application to look like every single other application online, and also you might have more complex needs. That's where you might decide, oh, I actually want an API first approach, or I want a headless approach. That's why like headless CMSs started to win out over WordPress, right? Is that folks wanted more control and more customization. And so it's not that the original like PayPal or Auth0 model is wrong. There are benefits to it. But I would say a lot of folks see the benefit of the alternative, which is more customization, more flexibility, better scalability that way, because they never have to like migrate providers again.
I wonder, so talking about like, I guess like the product, I guess, how do you price your product? Is it developer based, or is this more of like customer based, or is this like more of like project based? How do you, I guess like, yeah, how do you come up with like a pricing for each different customer?
Yeah, so we're usage based, but there are a few like usage like meters, billable meters that we use in usage. So monthly active users is like the number one metric that's used in both consumer applications and B2B applications. And then there are additional like usage add-ons like from that you can pay for. Device fingerprints are one of those, which is like for anti-bot traffic. And then on the B2B side, there's a couple more which have to do with like what we call enterprise connections. So like single sign-on, like SAML and OIDC are types of single sign-on. So that's where you're signing in with Okta, Azure, any of those types of systems. And those are ones where we do bill like, there's fewer of those SSO connections on the platform, but we bill much more. Like, it's like it's like $100 roughly versus like 10 cents. And the reason being is that when you need to support an enterprise SSO connection, it usually means that you have a contract on the other side of that that's worth like 5 figures. Like this is a large company that has a security team that part of their IT approval process for buying a vendor is that you have to have single sign-on as access to your dashboard for them, because that's their security requirement. And so the main thing we bill on is users, but we do have these add-ons like enterprise connections and fingerprints.
I wonder, so like thinking about going to different subsectors, like I guess like what's your go-to market strategy look like? So since I feel like you guys are are pretty established right now, but like I guess like when you before you land all the logos on the website, like I guess like how do you go to, I guess like do you talk to the chief security officer, or who are the, I guess like what does a selling motion kind of look like?
Yeah, so it's usually the engineering team that owns identity or authentication and fraud prevention. Sometimes it can be the head of security, but I'd say that's more specific to the fraud products. On the actual like auth products, it's usually an engineering leader. And the reason I say engineering leader and that can differ by size is that if you're a sub 50 person company, it could be the CTO that's actually making that decision. Above 50, above 100, it's almost, it's very rarely the CTO that's like directly involved in that. It's typically a, engineering manager, maybe like a staff engineer on their backend team that's been owning identity in the past, but they want to outsource it. And then when we think about like go to market, we're like a product-led sales company. And what I mean by that is like, that's kind of in between product-led growth and like sales-led, like top down. And product-led sales, what fits into that is like we have a self-serve flow where like anyone can get up and running. But we also find a lot of folks that will go through that will then raise their hand if they're an enterprise later and say, hey, I got a POC running. Now I want to talk about volumes because we have 1 million users. And I want to make sure that we're getting discounts on those. Or I want a solution design call just so I can understand if I'm using these products correctly and how I should evolve my stack over time. And so typically it is an eng leader, but it can be someone that's more like an eng manager or senior IC if it's a much larger company.
I'm just taking notes. How do you think about the budget that they have? So like, do they have to, let's say like, what is like the typical, I guess this is a really bad question because I don't want to ask too much detail, but like, I guess like, how do you think about the budget goes into security and authentication? I guess what percentage does this place into the entire engineering team, since like it sounds like there's like almost just like one guy that's dedicated to this in the entire 50 eng team? And like how do you think about, I guess, what's a budget that they are allowed to spend, and how do you negotiate with the company, since I feel like it's a really important part of every product, because security is like probably I would argue it's like the number one thing, because you don't really want people to just like fraud your account, right? So like how do you think about the pricing, or like the revenue stream, that not revenue stream, but like I guess like the spending stream that you are targeting towards?
Yeah, there's two different types of conversations we have. There's one, those that have an existing vendor, so they already have budget allocated to it. And there's two, those that are in-house, and I'll go into each in a bit of detail. On those that already have an existing vendor, what we typically find if someone's using Auth0, which is a pretty expensive vendor, and obviously is the legacy incumbent, typically when people have like opened up their financial books to us during a negotiation of like their vendor spend, typically it's like pretty often their like third or fourth largest spend of a vendor is Auth0, because AWS will typically be one, or whatever their cloud provider is, then maybe like Datadog as their second. But I think most often I've seen Auth0 when somebody's migrating from them, that be like pretty close to their third. And so that could be for, even like not super massive companies. Like these are companies that are 50, 100, 200 people. Sometimes they're still paying it even at that size, like $250,000 a year, because it's more indexed on usage, right? So it's more of an index of how many users do you have. If you think about it, like AI apps have so many users, even if a lot of them are more efficient in terms of headcount. And so that's one piece where it's very clear in those negotiations that they have a number in mind. Both they know what they spend a day, they know what they want to spend, and usually we can give price benefits to something like an Auth0, but often that's not the driver. Like you might not migrate just for price, because to be honest, like a migration is never like the top of mind thing. Like you don't get up in the morning and say, I want to migrate my auth today. You do it because some other issue is happening. Like you can't scale from a customization standpoint. You can't scale from serving enterprises the way that you want to. You can't scale your fraud prevention the way you want to. But anyways, that's kind of how those negotiations goes. It has a starting point at least, because there's a budget in place. And we can either come in at that budget, sometimes increase that budget if we're doing more for them, because we do auth and fraud prevention, versus Auth0 doesn't do much on the fraud prevention side. Or maybe we come in for less if there's some other way that we're helping them save money. On the in-house side, it's a little bit more interesting of a calculation that we do for folks, and there's more ROI. calculation involved, because you don't have a line item that's actually associated with that vendor spend of authentication. Instead, you might have all of the like cost that goes into the engineering team that's maintaining it, and the opportunity cost of what else they could be working on. So you might have like, 8, 10, 15 engineers. I think we've sold to some companies that had like 25 engineers that were touching identity at any given point. And there, obviously, what you're not saying is like, oh, we save you 25 engineers of time fully, but we do maybe take that down from 25 to like one engineer has to deal with the migration for like a couple months, and then you're free. And then those 25 engineers are probably not spending all of their time on that core identity, but they're maybe spending it like partially on it. And so you can do a calculation of like headcount savings to like reposition them to other more like high growth products that are core competencies. So typically that's part of the ROI calculation.
Taking notes. How sticky is this product? Is this like people just, since you mentioned like as there's a lot of people switch from Auth 0 to you guys, but how do you think about like to maintain these kind of people to sticking around?
It is quite sticky because obviously we touched like your users, which you can host in your own user database, but like we're tied to your users. You have sessions, which are actually like how people are logged in, even if they're not logging in every day, they're like retaining a session. And so it is quite like actually like integral to how your entire application works. Also the other data flows that you have, permissions, roles, etc. So once you integrate, it's not the type of thing you want to reevaluate every year. I would say people probably reevaluate every 3 to 5 years. And so if you think about it, it's a large market. So even on every 3 to 5 years, that's a lot of companies reevaluating their identity stack. But it is sticky enough that you don't want to look at it every 6 or 12 months. It's usually on, in the length of years rather than months in terms of how often people reevaluate it. So it's quite sticky.
I also know that I guess work with Bitcoin.com. Like when you're working with crypto related companies, what is like the normal standard? And is this like very different from like a traditional tech product, or like, how do you think about like from the crypto angle? Because whenever I think about like authorization, crypto really come to mind just because like there's so many just like trustless stuff. Like I don't know, like I don't know, like it's just like I feel like the entire crypto industry, just like when you log into something or you use a ledger to secure your money, like everything just like went completely different. Yeah, just curious, how do you think about authorization in the crypto space?
Yeah, so it's interesting in that it's actually quite similar to fintech is what we found. The fintech and crypto verticals, we sometimes group them because they have very similar priorities and challenges. Priorities are they want a simple enough user experience because they are competing for mind share against 8 other crypto exchanges that they could use. They're also, if you're a fintech, you're competing against every other neobank or other fintech that user could use. So you want it to be low friction for somebody to log in. But then, of course, you also have to balance the fact that you hold real money on that account. So you are a target for a lot of fraud, a lot of attacks. And so they probably have one of the greatest overlaps in terms of the Venn diagram of like utmost focus on UX, but also really high security constraints. And so that's where it's not too different, but I will say they are ones that they'll buy passwordless authentication more commonly. They'll buy anti-fraud tools more commonly. They'll usually have very strong 2FA methods in place that they'll want to provide to their end users, whether that's, SMS is like not the most secure. Maybe sometimes you offer it because users will uptake it more than like Google Authenticator. But now with passkeys, a lot of them are moving to passkeys because passkeys are kind of the nice blend of, you get a lot of the benefits of higher security 2FA methods like Google Authenticator or YubiKey. It's like actually closer to YubiKey than Google Authenticator in terms of like security guarantees you get. But it's really seamless because it's just a Touch ID or a Face ID. And so I would say crypto is interesting because they do have a lot to think about both on the UX and security side. But what I found is it's quite similar to fintech in that way in terms of usually what they're prioritizing.
What would happen when, like these apps that they are just like the Google Authentication app or something? So like, how does it work? So like, I know that like, one day I turned on the Twitter to FA. It's like even for myself, it's impossible to log in. So how do you like? I guess how does it work from the back end to go to another app to like authentify myself like how does Stytch work with these different platforms?
Yeah, it's well, it's mostly like some cryptographic key magic that's happening in the background. But effectively, what happens is that there's an algorithm for like Google Authenticator for these like time-based one-time passcodes, where you go into that app, you see that code refreshing every 15 seconds or whatever it is on a
What does
particular
that
app.
mean? I don't understand. Like those are just things I'm like, oh my god, what is happening? And then it's on another app. It's not like they send me a code to my phone. It's like
Yes.
a second app that how does it connect to my original app from the back end?
When you get enrolled, so the way the algorithm works is when you get enrolled for the first time, like you enroll that Google Authenticator as your 2FA. What you might notice is like sometimes that will stop working if your like time zone is messed up on your phone. Like sometimes if I had a phone that's been like off for like a year and then I have to find my old phone in order to get the authenticator code, it'll stop working. And the reason is that there's time drift that's actually happening in terms of the internal clock of like when you start that enrollment and the actual like algorithm on how it's generating those codes. And so sometimes you'll actually have to update your time zone. If you're ever having issues with this, it's usually a time zone issue because there's like some time drift. Because what's happening is not that it is mostly like this algorithm that is generating these like, I guess infinite in this case, where it's happening on an ongoing basis, where it allows them to check, is this the code that should have been generated based on when they enrolled and based on this time element? And so it is interesting in that it's one of those things where like Google Authenticator is probably one of the more opaque things to end users. It is better than SMS in the fact that it doesn't go over a telecommunication network. So somebody can't steal your phone number and get access to your Google Authenticator codes. They'd have to actually have your device and have the app. But so that's good. It's good from a security standpoint. I will say for the reason that you're saying, like it's hard for people to understand and that you have to download another app, it's not ideal for like user experience, in my opinion. Like it is better than SMS from a security side. But one of the reasons I'm a big fan of passkeys, like this biometric of like Face ID, Touch ID, is you get a lot of the security benefits of like not having to rely on SMS and telecoms and the idea that your phone number could be stolen. But you don't have to add additional friction of like downloading a new app like Auth or Google Authenticator.
Mm. Super interesting. Anyway, okay, pivot the talk to a little bit about like venture. Since we have a lot of listeners that are working in venture, they're maybe like starting their own fund or like working at a fund somewhere. Since you guys work with some of the best funds in the industry, and how do you think about like, when you are raising money? I guess first of all, like as a founder, what was the fundraising journey kind of look like for you? And second of all, it's like, how can people separate themselves to be like a good investor for the founders versus like the investor that are like just don't do anything, or like I guess like how do you pick one investor versus another?
Yeah, great question. So for us, we started the company pretty early on into the pandemic, spring, summer of 2020. And so the first time we fundraised was kind of an abnormal one where for our seed fundraise, everything was done over Zoom. We didn't meet people in person until we actually got term sheets. And then we had to do like socially distanced meetups at like Golden Gate Park and things like that. So it's kind of an odd, time in history to be fundraising. But generally, I would say the things that they're looking for and then that we were looking for, what I found generally that folks are looking for, especially at the early stages, is have you thought about this topic more than like even anyone on their team? Like you've turned over every rock and like gone down have you truly gone through the idea maze in a way that gives them confidence that you've thought through all the different dead ends that you might hit in certain methods, which is like led to here's the way that we're doing it this way. Here's the reason we'll have a wedge against these large incumbents. And like that really comes through in how you describe like the process of getting to the idea. Like how much have you done? How much work have you done to get to that idea? Both like earned experience, but also like customer conversations, prospect conversations, et cetera. So like, have you truly achieved like 99.9th percentile understanding of this market or customer or problem? I think that is one of the things that's looked for. The second thing is just pragmatically, can this be big enough for it to be a venture backable bet, right? Like I remember a while ago, there was like an article when WeWork was having some of those troubles where like a WeWork competitor had done a deep dive, like Business Insider or Fortune, that was talking about like they couldn't understand why no VCs wanted to back them versus WeWork. but like what they were pitching and and they were growing much more, probably you'd say, in a much more measured fashion. Like they weren't overgrowing or like getting over their skis, but they also didn't have ambitions to like open enough locations to actually get to a venture backable like revenue number that would give them the outcome that somebody thought that they could 100x the investment. And so the reason I say that is like, you can have a really good business idea or product idea, but it can not be a great venture idea, just because I have to look at this as like, if I'm a venture investor, I have our total fund and I know a large percentage of companies are going to fail in that fund. So I need the opportunity for home run slash grand slams. And so one thing I think you have to be clear about, if your first product that you're pitching, even if it's a great one, is not going to have a really large revenue opportunity, like you think it can only get to 10 million or 20 million or something like that, not going to get a lot of excitement from a lot of VCs unless you have a really clear view on how it allows you to do an act two, that'll like a product two that then will expand your total addressable market. So that's what I think what VCs look for. Obviously, you've had VCs on this call on these interviews before, so they can give you a better answer. But that was just from my perspective. From our side, what we were looking for is, we knew it was unlikely, and I think this is probably the case in most spaces, but maybe there are some exceptions. It's very unlikely your VC will ever know nearly as much as you do about your space. Often, like I think what you'll find is like, there's a spectrum between, do they know 1% of your space or like to 50%, like 25 to 50%? Like they're never going to know like 99% of your space, and they're not expected to, right? They're investing across a lot of different products. But do they know something to like the 99th percentile that is like a common element that you will have plenty of like pattern matching that will help you, regardless of if they don't know that much about authentication in our case? And so, for example, the reason we chose Benchmark and Chatham Pudagunta at Benchmark as our seed investor was like, that he had that in spades with DevTools, and he knew about authentication. Like he looked at other auth companies. He wouldn't, I don't think, call himself an auth expert, but he is a DevTools expert. And so he understands the go-to-market motion. He understands how buyers work. And that was really something that we were looking to, even though we'd had DevTools experience at our past companies, that was something we were looking for, is like, do they have a superpower? The other thing I would just say is like, personality wise, obviously you want folks that like you get along with, but I would say like the biggest thing for me is like, is this person a steady hand? Like, is their hand steady, or does it like shake? Like, do they like, what are they going to try to want to pivot at different places where like it's too early to pivot? Are they going to be, if you have one bad quarter, are they going to like, be running for the hills? And I do think finding people that are just like level-headed, calm, but like deliberative in how they'll push you is kind of what I look for in like personality traits.
What about co-founders? Since I know that you and your co-founder have worked together in Plaid, but like, I guess like, building a company is different from having a coworker that you work for 5 months and then they, I don't know, do something else. How do you think about like either the personality traits? Like, do you have to be BFF with the person, or like versus you feel like we just stay with the work situation and then like you don't really have like a personal connection that's fine with you? Or how do you think about like having to go through these like difficult conversation as well? Just because like I think working with someone is very different than like, oh, I like you as a friend, but like on the other hand, like there's so many difficult conversations, like for example the equity part, for example the product pivot, or raising from this investor or not. Like, how do you think about matching yourself with like a co-founder that can co-solve these kind of problems together?
I think the most important thing, like in my mind, is, do you have mutual trust with this person in terms of their judgment, both each other's judgment and like character? And that is probably like the most important piece outside of like, do you just work well together? Which I think though that contributes very directly to it. Cause like, Julianna and I had worked well together in like hackathons, like on different teams at Plaid. We knew that we could work well together based on like those hackathons. But I think if you just do that and like you work together on a project well, that's different than having like really deep trust in each other's judgment and character, where like on the judgment side, you trust that if they have an opinion that is different than yours, that it's like worth hearing out and figuring out like, can you get to the right solution? But you also trust they have the character that they will admit sometimes when like you're right, or you'll admit when they're right. Or sometimes you'll admit you don't actually know who's right, but we have to go down a path, and we know each of us are acting in good faith. So let's choose one of these. And so that's like the biggest one for like, it's not even just conflict resolution. It's also because like you have to, like a lot of times your co-founder and you are going to be operating a little bit autonomously, like, or in like not silos, but like I run mostly like go-to-market and ops. Julianna runs most of EPD and support. And so you need to understand that like, as you're running autonomously, you trust the judgment of that other individual. So that's really the biggest thing. And then like, in terms of like, do you have to be BFF or not? I think both models work, to be honest. Like I would say Julianna and I were good friends at Plaid, and prior to founding Stytch, we're still very good friends. We go to like big events. Like she went to my wedding. I went to her 30th birthday party. I'll go to her wedding very soon. And that's great, but it's not the type of thing where like we see each other all the time outside of work. It's mostly like for like big life events where we want to support each other, because you do see each other a lot at work. And sometimes you do need a little bit of like a respite just from like your work mind and your work mentality. Because we can't really get together and not talk about work. Like even if we're at like, my 30th birthday or her 30th birthday, we're going to be talking about work at some point over like, the drinks that we're having or over dinner. Yeah.
For sure. Okay. So I know that you mentioned that you like the Cloudflare founders, and then they are your angel investor as well. What do you like about the organization that you want to emulate for your own?
Sorry, which organization?
Cloudflare founders. So someone.
Yeah. Matthew Prince is an angel. I mean, I think they have just done such an amazing job at like, I don't know what their official mission statement is, but if I had to like summarize it, it's like keeping the internet honest or something like that. That's probably not their exact one, but like, I think their mission is like super ambitious, super lofty, but they truly have figured out how to get the like low level product into a mass number of developers' hands. And they've really balanced well, like being a great developer product for people just trying it out, getting up and running with it, but also building a really mature enterprise sales motion. Like we've been, we use them as an enterprise product now, just given our scale with them. And so overall, I think like that plus the fact that I think I don't know if I'd say they've reinvented themselves, but they've evolved really naturally amidst different technology changes, with also not getting like too far in advance of that. Like for example, when crypto was all the craze, I know every company was doing something in crypto, and I think they actually were putting out some of the most interesting content in crypto, even though they weren't like launching major products, because I think they have a really smart like R&D team that can both see, like they're really good at seeing the future, talking about the future, and then I think they're really smart about making bets on where things are actually going, or deciding not to make a bet from a product perspective if they don't think it's something where Cloudflare can offer a unique advantage versus others. So overall, I just think like, obviously their core infrastructure for like trust and like, trust on the internet. And then I think they built a great company, but I also think they continue to innovate at a really fast pace.
Love that. Okay. So we're at the last 1 minute fire round for you. Okay. So what's your favorite book?
Three Body Problem.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
It's interesting because I will first say actually my brother, because my brother has continuously pushed me to do things like outside of my comfort zone. Like there was a time I thought I would go to law school coming out of college. And he definitely was someone that pushed me to get more experiences, and always, always been, I think, the right like confidant on like career paths and things like that. I think in my career, I mean, I do think it would have been a different answer prior to Stytch, just because I had so many great people I worked with at Plaid. But now at Stytch, I work with Chathan so much at Benchmark. I have to say he's just like an incredibly helpful venture partner to work with, and has really improved my like ability, my talent as a leader, I think.
How did you guys got connected to Benchmark? Because you're like, I mean, just looking at your cap table, I was just like so amazed by, how many big name investors that you guys have involved, even from the angel perspective to, the formal like investors. I guess like, any tips on like fundraising, since I feel like you've done such a great job? This is not in the fire round, but I just really want to cover.
No. It kind of ties into your last question a little bit, where like if I was forced, like, I've just spent so much time with Chathan now that he is the easy answer in my post-Stytch years. But like my Plaid years, like Zach Perret, the CEO of Plaid, would have been up there as like somebody that impacted my career the most, like both taking a bet on me to join initially, but also being someone that was a proponent for me internally in terms of like different promotional paths, different like career paths there and opportunities. And he is actually the one that gave us the intro to Chathan. So a kind of fun story here is that I had given my notice to Plaid maybe in like May of 2020 or like April of 2020, probably April of 2020. And then as I was winding down my work, was starting to have some conversations with VCs about like, hey, just kicking the tires on this idea. Like, we'd done a lot of research into we'd start building the product. And then things in May and June started to go way faster than we expected. And I remember the first, I got a call from Zach asking if I was fundraising. And at first I was like, oh, like, I wonder if he's going to be frustrated that like I'm fundraising because I have like 2 days left at the job. And I wasn't officially fundraising yet, but I was having these conversations. And I remember in that call, the two things he said was like, one, can I angel invest? Like, I want to support you, which was super appreciative, like even outside of everything else he'd supported me with. And then two, he said, you have to take an intro to Chafin. I think, and I don't know if he said he's the best VC I've ever met or one of the best VCs, but he had just amazing things to say about Chafin, even though he wasn't on the Plaid cap table. And so having that conversation with him, he made the intro actually when we were very close to accepting another term sheet. We just had not met Benchmark at that point, but he said, you have to talk to Chafin, you have to talk to Benchmark, made that connection. And I think that relates back to a lot of the other earlier conversations we had before we met Benchmark, had been like friends that became angels, then introed us to a VC that they really liked. And I think you get when you get that warm intro, that's also a vote of confidence in you and your co-founder and the idea. And usually it's in the people themselves rather than the idea. That's really powerful.
Love that. Okay, so though I have so many questions, but we'll wrap with the fire round. I don't want to waste too much of time. Okay, who would you invite to your dinner party?
Ooh, anyone living or dead or just living?
It's your party.
Okay. Christopher Nolan, love his films. I would say Elon Musk is now like obviously controversial, but I do think he's still one of the most interesting people in the world. And so probably him. Trying to think who else. I mean, the Cloudflare founders, I wish I'd been able to spend more time with Michelle and Matthew. So I would definitely have them at that dinner party as well, just because great angels, or Matthew's a great angel, but don't have that much interaction. And yeah, maybe that's a good starting point. Maybe there's some more people to think about over time.
Where can we find you outside of work?
Generally hiking or running. I have a dog. I'll go on a lot of dog hikes in the Bay with, and then also I've gotten into half marathons over last year.
Amazing. Okay. Wow. Thank you so much, Reed, for coming on the show today. It was such a masterclass for Auth. I've never thought about like Auth was a particular sector within the entire security and fraud industry, but this was such a masterclass. Just want to say that.
No problem. Thank you for having me on. It was great to meet you a few weeks ago at the hackathon that we were both at, and I'm glad that we could make time for this.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. Let me just quickly